Welcome back, America. Hugh Hewitt, joined now by United States Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas. Good morning, Senator. Welcome back.
Good morning, Hugh. Good to be on with you.
Thank you. I got a number of things to cover. First of all, I got to ask you, your successor in interest in the David Dreyer Memorial segment is Congressman Mike Gallagher. And turns out I went, middle of the day to the barber shop, and I found his chief of staff there. I'm just wondering, does anyone go to work on time in the Hill? I mean, does anyone ever show up at like 9 and work till 5?
What I've noticed in my time there is no, they don't. 15-minute votes can take an hour and 15 minutes, and committee hearings don't start on time. I got to say, once you lose an ethic of punctuality, it slides rapidly and offends the sense of order for an old infantryman.
That brings me to my second question about your being an old infantryman. President Biden and Jake Sullivan have summoned Israelis to come and tell them how to secure the Egypt-Gaza border without, quote, smashing into Rafah. What do you think about that? Smashing into Rafah is just such a stupid way to put it, but that's what they said.
Well, obviously Israel can't destroy Hamas, can't kill or capture all of its leaders and fighters without going into Rafah. That's why not just Benjamin Netanyahu, but his war cabinet said they will. That's why it's the overwhelmingly popular position among the Israeli people. What Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden are doing, they're not trying to help an ally win, but they're trying to staunch losses in their own party. This is like Chuck Schumer's bizarre speech last week and deeply offensive call for new elections in Israel. As unprecedented as that is, the election that they're really worried about is not Israeli elections, it's American elections. They've let anti-Semitism fester in their ranks for years, and the American people are repulsed by it, and they're strongly pro-Israel. So you got Joe Biden and Jake Sullivan and Chuck Schumer doing everything they can to scramble to try to avoid losing this election at a time when Israel is engaged in an existential war.
I agree with that. And so this brings me to the question about Chuck Schumer. Why is he tough on Israel and soft on TikTok? Because TikTok could be on a timeline to divestment from the CCP if Chuck Schumer would attach it to the appropriations bill. There's no indication that he will. So why is he hard on Israel and soft on TikTok?
Well, again, the first point goes back to his own electoral problems and the outbreak of anti-Semitism the American people have seen, from outlaws blocking traffic in major cities to vandalizing Jewish-owned businesses or protesting the entrances of hospitals. So Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden are hard on Israel because they think it's what is necessary to hold their very fragile coalition together. I'm not sure why Chuck Schumer won't move forward on the TikTok bill. I mean, I agree with Chuck Schumer before he flip-flopped. Just a few years ago, he himself called for TikTok to be divested from ByteDance, its Chinese communist-dominated parent company. I think we need to move forward promptly with the bill the House of Representatives passed with an overwhelming bipartisan majority. And I've been working with Chairman Gallagher and a lot of my colleagues in the Senate to try to get that done as soon as possible.
Now, I want to switch to politics, Senator. Bernie Moreno won the three-way primary. I was neutral in that. I know all three of them. They were all on the program the same amount of time. Turns out that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have more sway in Ohio than Mike DeWine and Rob Portman. And that's fine. Ohio made up its mind, and Bernie won. Did you endorse in that race?
I did not endorse in the race. I met with and stayed in touch with all three candidates, all three good men. I look forward to working together now with Bernie Moreno and all Ohio Republicans to make sure that Bernie gets elected and we bring a sane Bernie into the United States Senate who helps deliver us the Republican majority.
Yeah, I'm calling it the Bernie offset. We've just got to offset the other Bernie. But I have a question about Sherrod Brown. I know that members of the Senate have a rule about not speaking ill of each other. This is a factual question. Has he ever had a job in the private sector, to your knowledge? Because he got out of Yale, and I think he went right to the State House. I don't think he's not a lawyer. I don't think he ever worked a day in the private sector.
Not to my knowledge either, Hugh. If he did, it certainly didn't make a dent on his understanding about the most basics of market economics and what it's necessary to create prosperity in the country and to create new jobs, because he has been in government, if not his entire life, at least for the vast, vast majority of his life.
Well, he's older than I am, and he's been in government longer than I've been out of college. I really don't understand how people can possibly understand the state if they've been in the government that long.
My goodness, Hugh, older than you. That is
I know. He's ancient. And he's like Joe Biden, the president. Let's talk about that. Did you go to the State of the Union, Senator? Did I ask you that last week?
I did attend the State of the Union. I thought I'd, for a moment, stumbled into a DNC convention speech. I didn't understand from the very first moment why Joe Biden was yelling at us. And I didn't imagine that it was going to play much better on TV than it did in the House chamber. And the polling we've seen since then proves that point, despite the Democrats' efforts to pick themselves up and pump themselves up and explain how Joe Biden is so strong and energetic. The polls since the State of the Union show it didn't make a dent because it didn't do anything to secure our border or bring down prices or make America more respected in the world.
What did you make about the straw man argument that he sent a border bill? Now, I know Jim Lankford, he's a fine senator. He did the best he could. There was no wall. There was no way. The wall is called table stakes on the show earlier today by Ron Johnson, which I'm stealing from him because the wall is table stakes for immigration reform. Did that work with anyone? Does anyone believe that nonsense that because Jim Lankford brought back the best the Democrats would give and it wasn't good enough that somehow the Republicans are responsible for this?
No, of course not, Hugh. This is a Biden-made disaster. Joe Biden is the one that campaigned on the promise to open our borders. That's exactly what he did on the first day. And that's what we've seen for the last 3+ years. I just returned from a trip to El Salvador, which, unlike the United States, has cracked down on violence and crime and is now one of the safest places in the Americas. But what I heard there is that many Salvadorans from the very beginning of the presidency, like people throughout Latin America and indeed across the world, began to make the very dangerous journey to America because Joe Biden told them they could get in. And that's the long and the short of it. And he doesn't need to send legislation to the Congress. He just needs to reverse his own disastrous policies. But what we really need to do is end his presidency and return Donald Trump to the White House if we want to secure the border.
Now, I've got to play for you back-to-back 2 Joe Biden quotes. One was from the El Porto restaurant in Phoenix yesterday, and the first one is from the Nevada appearance. He was in the swing states of Nevada and Arizona yesterday. Here's the president of Nevada, cut number 23.
And while I'm paying for it, we're also reducing the federal debt at the same time. The Republicans talk about, big tax and Democrats. Give me a break. Come on. I've already cut the federal deficit by $1 trillion since I took office.
All right, so let's go to cut 21 earlier in the day in Phoenix, cut number 21.
And we've cut deficit by the time it's out, it's over $2 trillion.
Okay, now, Senator Cotton, which is it? Did he cut the deficit by $1 trillion or by $2 trillion?
I don't know. It's confusing and confused is the way I would describe that. Obviously, Joe Biden hasn't cut the deficit. We've added trillions of more debt since Joe Biden took office. And I would remind all your listeners, that's at a time when we're coming out of a global pandemic and a national emergency. If anything, the deficit should have been falling from the moment Joe Biden took office. But rather what they did is spend trillions of dollars we don't have to advance their ideological priorities, things that the American people don't want and don't need at a price that we can't afford. And that's why we have runaway inflation.
I've got to play for you one more cut of the president yesterday at the El Porto, because this one amuses me. Cut number 16.
When I get criticism some places for having such a strong interest in Latino voters and Latino Americans and people here in the country, I point out to them, I said, imagine when you have 28% of all the students in public school are Latino and nationwide.
Okay, Senator Cotton, has President Biden ever been criticized for having an interest, to your knowledge? I'm unaware of what he's referring to for being criticized and being interested in Latino Americans. Do you have any idea what he's talking about?
No, once again, confused and confusing. My concern is that Joe Biden doesn't seem to have an interest in the well-being and prosperity and safety of any Americans, Latino, black, white, Asian, or anyone else.
Okay. Last question for you, Senator. There's a news story in Commentary magazine by Dr. Christine Rosen over at AEI called The Elite War on the American Middle Class and How to End It. And it turns out the great surprise to me is that 25% of students who attend American so-called elite universities, and you and I are both alums of Harvard, and they used Harvard as an example on their podcast, 25% are foreigners, which is just fine. I mean, foreigners can go, but 25%? Do you think that such places ought to get federal subsidies if 1 out of 4 places is not open to an American applicant?
Well, I think that's much too high, Hugh. Again, it's one thing to have some international students to add that different kind of perspective to your student body, but to have 1 in 4, again, all it's doing is artificially suppressing the opportunities for American students to take those spots. It's also, I suspect, driven financially because almost all of those foreigners are the children of wealthy elites from those countries, and therefore they're paying full freight tuition, whereas, kids from rural Arkansas or industrial towns in Ohio may be getting financial aid. But it seems to me much too high. But then again, since I wouldn't wish those schools today on my worst enemy's kids, maybe it's good that they got so many foreign kids. Like, fewer Americans,
I would go to the Ohio State University
by them.
or the University of Arkansas before. I will have no influence on what my grandkids do. But honestly, I think they're hothouses of non-learning. I don't know what they do anymore.
No, that's I recently heard someone say that their kid had gotten into Princeton, and a third person looked at him and said, "I'm so sorry to hear that," because they are hothouses of indoctrination. And I talked to a tech CEO, major tech CEO of a highly respected and accomplished company, and he said that he simply doesn't recruit at Ivy League campuses anymore. He'd much sooner hire an engineer or a computer programmer from Ohio State or some other big flagship university like the University of Arkansas, because they're not indoctrinated. They're not coming into his company with a political agenda and expecting him and his company to cater to them. They're coming there because they want to do the work and they want to accomplish the mission, which in many cases supports law enforcement and our military, and they want to advance in their career.
The last thing, I want you to read this. It turns out the American military is overwhelmingly recruiting its enlisted people from the middle class, not from the lower class, not from the upper class. Does that surprise you?
No, Hugh, it's always been a falsehood that people who join the military do so because they're out of options. I mean, it is true, of course, that if you're very poor or you've had run-ins with the law, that the military and good order and discipline it provides helps turn your life around. But for the most part, the military recruits some of the very best kids we have in the country.
It's a fascinating article. I recommend it to you because I think it's quite the reveal on what's going on in the country. Senator Tom Cotton, follow him at Send Tom Cotton on X. Come right back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt.